June 1940, North Atlantic Ocean. The convoy of British ships cut through dark waters while German U-boats lurked somewhere below. On the decks of HMS Duchess of York, 7,000 German prisoners stood packed together, wondering where they were going. These men had surrendered in France, in Norway, in battles across Europe. They expected to stay in England like most prisoners of war. Instead, British guards had loaded them onto ships and pointed them west across the Atlantic. Nobody would tell them their final destination. The prisoners had just spent 3 months in British camps, and those months had been miserable. Camp Kempton Park outside London held 18 men in rooms designed for 8 people. The prisoners slept on thin mattresses laid so close together that you couldn't walk between them. You had to step over sleeping men to reach the door. The food was worse. Each man received 1,200 calories per day, barely enough to stop the hunger pains. Breakfast was watery porridge. Lunch was thin soup with a piece of bread. Dinner was boiled potatoes and sometimes a tiny piece of meat the size of your thumb. The British people themselves were starving because German submarines kept sinking supply ships, so the prisoners understood why rations were so small. But understanding didn't fill empty stomachs. Back in Germany, these soldiers had lived under strict military discipline. Wehrmacht training camps were harsh places where officers shouted constantly and recruits ran until they collapsed. Even German soldiers with families at home faced tight food rations because the government sent most resources to the military. The prisoners knew hardship. They expected prison to be harder. What they couldn't have imagined was what waited for them across the ocean. Britain in June 1940 faced the worst crisis in its history. At Dunkirk, just weeks earlier, 300,000 British and French soldiers had barely escaped from France, leaving behind all their tanks, trucks, and heavy weapons. Now, German forces controlled all of Europe from Norway to Spain. Adolf Hitler's army stood just 20 miles across the English Channel, preparing to invade. German bombers would soon begin the Blitz, dropping thousands of tons of explosives on London and other cities. Winston Churchill, Britain's Prime Minister, told his people to prepare for Nazi paratroopers landing in their fields and German tanks rolling through their streets. In this desperate situation, Britain had a strange problem. 136,000 German prisoners crowded into camps across England and Scotland. These prisoners needed guards, food, housing, and constant watching. But Britain needed every available soldier to defend against invasion. Security experts warned Churchill that keeping so many enemy soldiers on British soil created terrible risks. What if German paratroopers landed near a prison camp and freed all the prisoners? What if prisoners organized mass breakouts during bombing raids? What if some prisoners were actually spies waiting for the invasion to begin sabotage operations? Churchill's military advisors proposed a radical solution. Canada, Britain's ally across the Atlantic, had endless wilderness and very few people. It had forests so vast you could walk for 500 miles without seeing a town. It had winters so cold that the temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. In such a place, prisoners wouldn't need many guards because the land itself would be the prison. Barbed wire fences meant nothing compared to 1,000 miles of empty forest and freezing cold. The advisors calculated that shipping prisoners to Canada would free up 20,000 British guards for combat duty. But the plan seemed insane. German submarines controlled the Atlantic Ocean. U-boats hunted in groups called wolf packs, surrounding convoys and sinking ship after ship. Sending defenseless prison ships across those waters guaranteed that some would be torpedoed. Many prisoners would drown. Some people in Churchill's government argued this would be murder. How could Britain send prisoners on a journey with such deadly risks? Churchill made his decision anyway. The prisoners had to go. Britain's survival mattered more than anything else. If some prison ships sank, that was a tragedy, but Britain couldn't afford to keep 136,000 enemy soldiers on the home soil during an invasion. The first convoy would carry 7,000 Germans to Canada as a test. If they arrived safely, more would follow. The prisoners on HMS Duchess of York knew none of this. They only knew they were sailing into the unknown. Many had heard stories about Canada from school geography lessons. It was a frozen wasteland, they remembered, where hardly anyone lived. The few people who did live there were rough frontier types who hated Germans because Canada had fought against Germany in the last war. Some prisoners whispered that the British were taking them to Canada to work as slave labor in mines. Others feared they would be dumped in the wilderness and left to freeze. A few remembered propaganda they'd heard from Nazi Party officials before the war. These officials had claimed that democracies like Britain and Canada were weak, corrupt places where rich people lived in luxury while poor people starved. The propaganda promised that Germany's strength would soon crush these decadent nations. Now, standing on the ship's deck as it crossed the cold Atlantic, the prisoners wondered what was true and what was lies. In 3 weeks, they would reach Canada and find out. What they discovered there would shake everything they believed about the world. But first, they had to survive the crossing. Down below the waves, German submarines searched for targets. Any moment might bring the explosion of a torpedo strike, the rush of freezing water, the screaming chaos of a sinking ship. The prisoners waited and wondered. Where exactly were they going? What kind of camps waited for them in Canada? And why, in just a few years, would thousands of German soldiers on battlefields across Europe begin begging their captors with desperate voices to send them to Canada, to those mysterious camps in the frozen north, rather than to prisons in Britain or America? The answer would change how these men understood power, strength, and what it meant to be civilized. The ships arrived in Quebec after 2 weeks of tense sailing. Not a single torpedo had struck them. The prisoners stumbled off HMS Duchess of York onto Canadian docks, grateful to stand on solid ground again. Guards immediately loaded them onto trains, long passenger trains that headed west into Canada's interior. The prisoners pressed their faces against windows, staring at the landscape rolling past. They traveled for hours seeing nothing but trees, then more hours with nothing but flat grasslands stretching to the horizon, then more trees. In Germany, you couldn't travel 2 hours without passing through a dozen villages and several cities. Here in Canada, the train rolled through emptiness for an entire day. A Luftwaffe pilot named Hans Kremer, who had bombed British cities just months earlier, counted the hours between towns. 6 hours passed before they saw even a small village. He wrote in a secret diary he kept hidden in his boot that the emptiness frightened him more than any bombing mission. How could people live in such isolation? What kind of place had they come to? The train finally stopped at a camp in Bowmanville, Ontario, a town east of Toronto. Guards called it Camp 30. The prisoners filed off the train, expecting the worst. They had lived in cramped British camps where 18 men shared a single room. They assumed Canada would be even worse because this was the wilderness, far from civilization, where conditions must be primitive. Instead, the guards led them to long wooden barracks that looked newly built. Inside, each room held 6 beds for 6 men. Actual beds with real mattresses, not straw sacks on the floor. Each man got his own bed with clean sheets and a thick wool blanket. The room had windows that opened, letting in fresh air. There was space to walk around, space to store belongings, space to breathe. A Luftwaffe officer named Klaus Becker stood in the middle of his assigned room and slowly turned in a circle. He had more personal space here as a prisoner than he'd had in his entire life, even as a free man in Germany. But the real shock came at dinner time. Guards led the prisoners to a mess hall and told them to sit at long tables. Then Canadian workers began bringing out food. The prisoners stared in silence as plates were set before them. Each plate held scrambled eggs, 3 strips of bacon, 2 pieces of white bread with a real butter, and boiled potatoes. On the side sat a cup of coffee and a small glass of orange juice. Hans Kremer picked up the orange juice and held it to the light. He hadn't seen an orange since 1938. Oranges didn't grow in Germany, and the country had stopped importing them when the war began. He sniffed the juice, confirming it was real, then drank it in one swallow. The sweetness made his eyes water. Around him, other prisoners ate in stunned silence. A few men cried while they chewed their bacon. The British camps had given them 1,200 calories per day. This single breakfast contained more calories than an entire day's rations in England. Over the next weeks, the prisoners discovered more impossible things. The camp sprawled across 50 acres with open yards, where prisoners could walk freely during the day. Guards numbered only about 1 for every 50 prisoners. In British camps, there had been 1 guard for every 12 prisoners, all watching constantly. Here, the guards seemed relaxed, almost friendly. They carried rifles, but rarely pointed them at anyone. Some guards were older men, farmers and workers from nearby towns, not career soldiers. They treated the prisoners like human beings rather than dangerous enemies. The food kept coming in quantities the prisoners couldn't believe. Lunch brought soup with actual meat in it, sandwiches made with cheese and ham, apples from local orchards. Dinner featured chicken or beef, vegetables cooked with butter, fresh bread from the camp bakery. The prisoners estimated they were eating 2,800 calories per day, more food than they had eaten as active soldiers in the German military. Some men who had been thin and hungry for years began gaining weight. Their uniforms started fitting tightly across their shoulders and stomachs. In August of 1941, something happened that became legendary among the prisoners. A truck drove through the camp gates on a hot summer afternoon. Guards called the prisoners out to the yard and began handing out small paper cups. Inside each cup was vanilla ice cream, cold and sweet and impossibly rich. Otto Kretschmer, a famous U-boat commander who had sunk 47 Allied ships before being captured, stood holding his ice cream cup like it was a bomb that might explode. His mind couldn't process what was happening. Germany and Canada were at war. He had killed perhaps 1,000 Allied sailors by sinking their ships, and now his enemies were giving him ice cream on a summer day. He said out loud to another officer standing nearby that this made no sense. They were at war. In war, you killed your enemies, or you starved your prisoners. You didn't give them ice cream. The other officer had no answer. Both men ate their ice cream in confused silence. Prisoners who worked in the camp kitchen saw things that shocked them even more. The kitchen had electric refrigerators, huge industrial stoves, and food storage rooms stacked with supplies. One prisoner who had worked as a cook in Berlin carefully counted what he saw. The camp kitchen stored 3,000 pounds of beef, 1,500 pounds of potatoes, 800 loaves of bread, and countless cans of vegetables and fruit. This was for only 600 prisoners. He did the mathematics in his head and realized this weekly supply could feed his entire street back in Berlin for a month. How could Canada have so much food when Germany, which controlled most of Europe, was rationing everything? The guards weren't cruel or brutal like the prisoners expected. Many played soccer with the prisoners during recreation time. They shared cigarettes and talked about farming, about the weather, about life before the war. At Camp Nays in northern Ontario, guards and prisoners worked together building a hockey rink during the winter of 1942. They cut ice, cleared snow, and set up boards around the edges. Then they played hockey games, guards and prisoners on mixed teams, laughing when someone fell or missed a shot. A former SS officer named Martin Weber watched these games with growing confusion. He had been taught that democracy made people weak and soft. He had been told that Germans were a master race, stronger and better than others. But these Canadian guards didn't seem weak. They were strong, healthy men who worked hard and treated prisoners with a kind of casual dignity that Weber had never experienced in the German military. They didn't need to shout or hit people to maintain order. They simply expected everyone to behave like adults, and somehow that worked. The prisoners began asking guards for English lessons. They wanted to learn the language, to understand what people were saying around them. They asked questions about Canada, about how farms worked here, about electricity and machinery and democracy. The propaganda they had heard in Germany claimed that democracies were chaotic, corrupt places where nothing functioned properly. But everything here seemed to function smoothly. The food arrived on time. The buildings stayed warm in winter. The rules made sense and applied to everyone equally. Slowly, carefully, the prisoners began to wonder if everything they had been told was a lie. The months passed, and the prisoners settled into the rhythm of camp life. They worked, they studied English, they played sports with the guards, but nothing would prepare them for what came next. December 24th, 1942, Camp 30, Bowmanville. The mess hall had been decorated with pine branches and paper chains made by prisoners during craft time. 600 German officers sat at long tables waiting for Christmas dinner. Most had been prisoners for over 2 years now. They had adjusted to camp life, to the routines, to the surprising comfort of captivity in Canada. But nothing prepared them for what the kitchen workers began carrying out on large metal trays. Each prisoner received a plate piled high with food, half a pound of roast turkey, the meat so tender it fell apart when touched with a fork, a mountain of mashed potatoes with rich brown gravy pooled in a crater on top, bright orange carrots and green beans cooked with butter, cranberry sauce, sweet and tart, a thick slice of apple pie for dessert, real coffee, hot and strong, not the weak substitute they had drunk in Germany, and chocolate, small squares of dark chocolate, one for each man. Oberst Wilhelm Scherg, a colonel who had fought in Poland and France before his capture, sat staring at his plate without moving. He was a career military officer, a man who prided himself on discipline and emotional control. But his hands were shaking. He picked up his fork and set it down again. Around him, other officers were crying silently, tears running down their faces while they ate. These were not tears of homesickness or sadness about being away from family on Christmas. These were tears of realization, of understanding, of having your entire view of the world crack apart. Scherg had been doing mathematics in his head. This single meal contained approximately 4,200 calories. In Berlin, civilian rations allowed about 1,500 calories per day total. That meant this one Christmas dinner for enemy prisoners contained more food than German civilians got to eat in almost 3 days. And this wasn't emergency rations or minimal survival food. This was a feast, prepared with care, served with dignity to men who had fought against Canada and its allies. Scherg looked around the mess hall at 600 German officers eating in stunned silence. He thought about his wife and children back in Munich. What were they eating tonight for Christmas? Probably potato soup if they were lucky. Maybe some bread. Certainly no turkey, no chocolate, no real coffee. The German government had told its people they were winning the war, that victory was certain, that their sacrifices would lead to triumph. But if Germany was winning, why could Canada feed its prisoners better than Germany fed its own people? The answer was obvious and terrible. Germany wasn't winning. Germany had never been winning, not in the way that mattered. Military victories meant nothing if your economy couldn't support the war. All the conquered territory, all the stolen resources, all the forced labor, and Germany still couldn't match what a democracy like Canada produced through normal peacetime farming and manufacturing. Franz Hoffmann, a captain sitting next to Scherg, said out loud what everyone was thinking. "If they can give us this," he said quietly, "what are their own soldiers eating? What does their country have?" The table fell silent. No one had an answer because the answer was too frightening to speak. Their country had everything. More than enough for their military, more than enough for their civilians, and still enough left over to give generous portions to thousands of enemy prisoners. The Nazi Party propaganda had taught them that democracy made nations weak, that giving people freedom led to chaos and poverty, that only strong dictators like Hitler could organize a country effectively. But here was the evidence on their plates proving that everything they had been told was backwards. The democracy was strong, the dictatorship was weak, and they had fought for the wrong side. In January 1943, the camp commanders offered prisoners an opportunity to do paid work. The Geneva Convention rules about prisoners of war said that enlisted men could be required to work, but officers could only work if they volunteered. The pay was 25 cents per day, money that prisoners could use to buy small items from the camp store or save for after the war. Dozens of prisoners volunteered, eager to do something besides sit in camp all day. They were sent to work at lumber camps, paper mills, and farms around Ontario. Heinrich Weber, a farmer's son from Bavaria, spent the summer working at an apple orchard near Camp 30. The Canadian farmer who owned the orchard had 200 acres of apple trees. He owned a John Deere tractor that could plow a field in hours. Back in Bavaria, Weber's father farmed 20 acres using 2 horses. It took his father all day to plow a single field. This Canadian farmer, working alone with his tractor, did the work of 20 German farmers. Weber lived in a small cottage on the farm property during the work season. The farmer and his family lived in a large house nearby. One evening, the farmer invited Weber to dinner. Weber walked into the house and stopped in the doorway, staring. The family had electric lights in every room. They had a radio in the kitchen and another in the living room. They had a telephone on the wall. The 5 children each had their own bedroom upstairs. Weber came from a family of 9 people who shared 3 rooms in a house with no electricity and no running water. During dinner, the farmer's wife asked Weber about Germany, about his family's farm, about what life was like there. Weber lied. He said his family lived similarly to this Canadian family. He was too ashamed to tell the truth, too embarrassed to admit that his father, a hard-working farmer, lived in conditions that would be considered poverty here in Canada. The farmer owned 2 trucks, a tractor, and more machinery than Weber could identify. Weber's father owned 2 horses and some hand tools. The contrast was so vast it seemed like they lived in different centuries, not just different countries. Back at camp, prisoners had access to a library with 3,000 books. The camp administration also provided newspapers and magazines, uncensored, so prisoners could read about the war's progress. Many prisoners spent hours in the library reading about American industrial production. The numbers seemed impossible. In 1943, American factories built 96,000 aircraft, 45,000 tanks. Liberty cargo ships were being launched every 42 hours, faster than German submarines could sink them. A naval officer named Hans Joachim Kruse sat in the library doing calculations on paper. He had been a U-boat officer before his capture, so he understood naval production and logistics. He added up the numbers from the magazines and compared them to what he knew about German production. The United States alone, not counting Britain, Canada, and other allies, was producing approximately 40 times more war material than Germany, 40 times more. Kruse stared at his calculations, checking them repeatedly, hoping he had made a mistake. But the mathematics were simple and clear. Germany could not win this war. It was a mathematical impossibility. They were fighting an enemy with 40 times their industrial capacity. The prisoners began having quiet conversations late at night in their barracks. They talked about what they were learning, what they were seeing, what it all meant. Some had been members of the Nazi Party, believers in Hitler's vision of German supremacy. Those beliefs were becoming impossible to maintain. If Germans were the master race, superior to all others, then how did the inferior democracies have all this wealth, all this food, all this industrial power? How did the weak democratic system produce strength that the strong dictatorship couldn't match? The camp allowed prisoners to form elected councils to govern internal camp affairs. Prisoners voted for representatives who would speak to the camp administration about problems and requests. This democratic process was foreign to men who had lived under military dictatorship. In the Wehrmacht, officers gave orders and soldiers obeyed without question. Here in camp, they were learning to discuss issues, vote on solutions, and compromise. Some prisoners found this frustrating and slow. Others found it strangely satisfying to have a voice in decisions that affected their lives. Martin Weber, the former SS officer who had watched the hockey games in confusion, now worked in the camp garden. Prisoners were allowed to grow vegetables and keep the produce. Weber spent his days planting tomatoes, lettuce, and beans. He talked with Canadian guards about growing seasons, about soil quality, about crop rotation. These conversations were friendly, almost normal, as if the war didn't exist. Weber began to understand something that Nazi ideology had never taught him. Strength wasn't about domination or cruelty. Real strength was about having enough resources, enough wealth, enough confidence that you could afford to be kind even to your enemies. Canada had that strength. Germany, despite all its military victories, did not. May 1946, Hamburg docks. Hans Creamer stepped off the repatriation ship onto German soil after 6 years as a prisoner in Canada. The city he remembered no longer existed. Hamburg had been 75% destroyed by Allied bombing. Mountains of rubble lined every street. Buildings stood like broken teeth, their walls blown out, their roofs collapsed. People moved through the ruins like ghosts, thin and hollow-eyed, wearing whatever scraps of clothing they could find. Children sat on piles of broken bricks begging for food from anyone who passed. Creamer carried a small suitcase that held everything he owned. Inside were 3 thick wool blankets given to him by Canadian guards as farewell gifts. A copy of the Canadian Bill of Rights that he had requested from the camp library. Photographs of Camp 30, pictures showing the gardens, the sports fields, the comfortable barracks, and 12 extra pounds of body weight from 6 years of eating 2,800 calories per day, while his countrymen starved on 1,400. He walked through Hamburg's ruins toward his family's apartment, or what remained of it. The building still stood, but half of it had been destroyed by bombs. His mother and sister lived in 2 rooms on the ground floor. When he knocked on the door, his mother opened it and stared at him for a long moment before recognizing her own son. Then she began to cry. But these weren't tears of joy or relief. These were tears of something else, something bitter and complicated. "You look like you've been on holiday," she said finally. Her voice was sharp, almost angry. Creamer looked at his mother and saw a woman who had aged 20 years in 6. Her face was deeply lined. Her hands shook. Her dress hung loose on a frame that had lost too much weight. Behind her, his sister sat at a small table eating a bowl of watery soup with a piece of black bread. That was their lunch. That was probably their only real meal of the day. Cremer tried to explain about the camps, about the treatment, about the food. His mother didn't want to hear it. "You're saying the enemy treated you better than our own government treated us," she said. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. Cremer had no answer because it was completely true. He had lived better as an enemy prisoner than his family had lived as loyal German citizens supporting the war effort. That night, lying on a thin mattress on the floor of his mother's apartment, Cremer thought about the contrast between the 2 worlds. In Canada, even now, families were sitting down to dinners of meat and vegetables and fresh bread. Children had their own bedrooms, farms had tractors and electricity. Here in Germany, people fought over scraps and lived in ruins. The country that was supposed to be strong had been broken. The country that was supposed to be weak had barely been scratched. Across Germany, other returning prisoners had similar experiences. They came home healthy and well-fed to find their families starving in destroyed cities. Many prisoners felt guilty for having survived so comfortably while their loved ones suffered. Some kept quiet about their experiences, sensing that talking about Canadian kindness and abundance would only create resentment and pain. But other prisoners spoke openly about what they had learned. Wilhelm Scherg, the colonel who had cried during the Christmas dinner, returned to Bavaria and eventually became a mayor of a small town. He implemented town councils where citizens could vote on local issues. He insisted on transparent record-keeping so everyone could see how money was spent. He created systems where complaints could be heard and addressed fairly. When people asked why he governed this way, so differently from how German towns had been run before the war, he told them about Camp 30. He told them about elected prisoner councils. He told them about a system where even enemies were treated with dignity and given a voice in their own affairs. Heinrich Weber, the farmer's son who had worked at the Canadian apple orchard, tried to rebuild his family's farm in Bavaria. But farming in post-war Germany was nearly impossible. There was no fuel for machinery, even if you could afford to buy machinery. Most farm animals had been killed for food during the war. Seeds were scarce. Fertilizer didn't exist. Weber and his father planted crops by hand and hoped for rain. After 2 years of struggling, Weber made a decision. In 1952, he applied to immigrate to Canada with his entire family. His application letter explained that he had spent 3 years as a prisoner of war in Canada. Those 3 years, he wrote, were the best years he had known under any government. He wished to raise his children in a place where human dignity was measured not by ideology or race or political loyalty, but by how even your enemies were treated. Canada accepted his application. The Weber family arrived in Ontario in the spring of 1953 and started a new life growing vegetables on land that would have seemed impossibly abundant to Weber's grandfather. Throughout the war, but especially after 1942, stories about Canadian camps spread among German soldiers through a whisper network that violated military rules. Letters from prisoners sometimes got smuggled back to the front lines. They described the food, the treatment, the space, the basic humanity of the camps. German soldiers facing capture began asking Allied interrogators a simple question: which camp? The answer they desperately wanted to hear was Canada. British camps were bearable, American camps were decent, but Canadian camps had become legendary, almost mythical places where even the worst parts of being a prisoner of war were softened by unexpected kindness. Some German units, surrounded and facing certain capture in late 1944 and 1945, deliberately chose to surrender to Canadian forces rather than to British or American units. They hoped Canadian soldiers would send them north to those camps they had heard about. Many were disappointed to learn they would be held in Europe instead. The lucky ones who did reach Canada found the stories were true. The statistics tell part of the story. Of 35,000 German prisoners held in Canada during the war, only 98 ever escaped. That's an escape rate of 0.28%. British camps had escape rates of 12%. American camps had rates of 7%. But numbers don't explain why the escape rate was so low. It wasn't just the vast distances and harsh winters. It was that many prisoners didn't want to escape. They were treated better in captivity than they had been treated in their own army. Why risk your life running through frozen wilderness when you had warm beds, full meals, and guards who played soccer with you? After the war ended, 6,000 German prisoners applied to stay in Canada permanently rather than return to Germany. They wanted to become Canadian citizens and build new lives in the country that had imprisoned them. Canada accepted 1,800 of these applications. 1,800 former enemy soldiers who liked their prison so much they wanted to never leave. Otto Kretschmer, the U-boat commander who had stood confused while holding ice cream, returned to Germany and later joined the new West German Navy. He rose to the rank of admiral and became one of the most respected naval officers in post-war Germany. In 1962, a journalist interviewed him about his war experiences. The journalist expected stories about submarine battles, about sinking Allied ships, about dramatic escapes from depth charges. Instead, Kretschmer wanted to talk about ice cream. "I sank 47 Allied ships," Kretschmer said. "I killed perhaps 1,000 men doing that. I did this believing Germany was strong, right, and destined to rule Europe. Then I became a prisoner in Canada, and they gave me ice cream on a summer afternoon. That ice cream taught me more about real power than all my torpedoes ever did. True strength isn't about what you can take from your enemies. It's about what you can afford to give them. Germany could barely feed its own people while conquering half of Europe. Canada could feed its enemies generously while barely participating in the war. That's when I knew which system would survive and which deserved to." The story of German prisoners in Canada reveals something profound about civilization and power. The Germans begged to be sent to Canada not because Canadians were weak or foolish or didn't understand war. They begged to go there because Canada was strong enough to be humane. In those camps, surrounded by abundance they had never known, treated with dignity they had never expected, thousands of enemy soldiers learned what no propaganda could teach and no battle could prove. They learned that the true measure of any society isn't how it treats its heroes or its loyal citizens. The true measure is how it treats the people it has every reason to hate. The ice cream, the Christmas dinners, the blankets and books and soccer games weren't rewards. They were demonstrations of what free societies could achieve when they organized around human dignity instead of around power and control. Those demonstrations did more to defeat Nazi ideology than 100 battlefields. Because you cannot maintain faith in a master race when the inferior democracy feeds you better than your own superior fatherland ever did. You cannot believe in the strength of dictatorship when you see that democratic abundance firsthand. And you cannot forget kindness shown by enemies who had every right to be cruel. That is the lesson the ice cream taught. That is what those prisoners carried home in their hearts, more important than any souvenir, more lasting than any scar. The memory of being treated like human beings by the very people they had tried to destroy.